So, very warm welcome, everyone. Very good afternoon to this experiment, this experimental online series, new work on the Roman Republic that Mattia Balbo from Turin and myself have thought of setting up when we confronted the harsh reality of the interruption, at least for the foreseeable future, of the usual cycle of conferences and workshops and research seminars that traditionally fosters and supports the exchange of ideas and indeed of the presentation of new and ongoing work. And so we thought we'd try out a Zoom series with no clear thematic remit to it, except for the Roman Republic and indeed new work on the Roman Republic. And we are delighted really by the response that we got, both from potential speakers in the first place and then from, well, the wider public of Republican aficionados that responded to our announcement, to our ad. So here we go. It's very much of an experiment. We'll see how it goes. We'll see where it takes us. And we are delighted to start this series with a paper, a seminar by Catherine Steele, Professor of Classics at the University of Glasgow, and of course, very well known to anyone with even a tangential interest in Cicero, I suppose, and of course, especially well known to anyone working on the Roman Republic. Very impressive and very distinguished body of work, starting from Cicero, Rhetoric and Empire, 2002, reading Cicero, 2005, and of course the editorship of the Cambridge Companion to Cicero, and in 2013, the same year in which the Companion appeared, of course, Catherine also published at the End of the Roman Republic, major textbook with Edinburgh University Press. She is, as you know, the general editor of the fragments of the Roman Republican Orators, stemming from an European Research Council funded project, and she would be indeed talking about an aspect of that project today. Just one quick final point about housekeeping, as it were, before I hand over to Catherine for her paper. Catherine will be speaking for, I reckon, 45 minutes or thereabouts. Anyway, it's up to her, really, how long to speak for. We want to make plenty of time for questions. We feel that the best way forward in this respect would be just for people to register their interest in asking a question through the chat function, which Mattia and I are going to keep an eye on. So no blue hand, please, for the purpose of this exercise, but just even a quick line in the chat session would be enough to book yourselves for a question. If you're more comfortable typing your question, that's absolutely fine. And we'll then take it from there, and we'll follow the order of our chat feed, as it were. So really, as I say, without further ado, and with warmest thanks for agreeing to join us today, and indeed for what is our first session, over to Catherine, who'll be talking about provincial government in Republican oratory, the view from FRRO. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Federico. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Federico, and thank you, Mattia, for putting this together and for asking me to participate. I should perhaps say a word about the paper. I will read my paper, but I should just say a word about how it came to be. This is a revised version of a paper I gave last month in Dresden. I mean, it was a virtual conference at a meeting that Dennis Pausch organised about invectivity. And it's one of those papers that's had a slightly didn't really turn out to be what I thought it was going to be about. I thought I was going to write a paper about what we can say about the invective in speeches around provincial government prior to Cicero. And obviously from the perspective of FRRO, that seemed to me a question that we might be in a better position to answer than we have previously, and it would be worth asking. And actually the paper turned out to be much more about the problems of using material about pre-Ciceronian oratory, which is something that, you know, those of us who've been working on FRRO have long been aware, but I was very struck by how thinking about repetundae and proto-repetundae cases, actually through this problem of reception and the fact that so much of our evidence about Republican oratory is created in the late Republic, really into relief. So that's really what this paper is going to be talking about. It kind of has an invective starting point, but it's not really going to end up there. And I have to apologize to anybody who was at that Dresden conference. You will have heard most of this before. So sorry about that. As I say, lightly revised, but I'm still working through some of the ideas. And one of the reasons I was keen to try this paper out on you, and Dennis Pausch, the organizer, is happy with that and with the recording, is to get some more feedback about these problems. Okay, so that's by way of apology and, you know, setting the scene. The handout is simply a list of some of the texts that I'm going to be talking about. So if it's helpful to have to hand, obviously, there it is. So anyway, let me start. Provincial government was a fruitful source of invective material in the late Roman Republic. The Quaestio de rebus repetundis provided a forensic space in which the behaviour of magistrates overseas and others alleged to have benefited from their exactions was laid out and judged. Outside of a forensic context, the shortcomings of provincial government were the object of debate within the Senate and also at Contiones. The government of Rome's empire was a matter for policy debate, as Kip Morrell in particular has recently underscored for us. But the terms of that debate were very often framed by perceived or alleged transgressions by individuals, and the result was a rich seam of invective, principally, though not exclusively, preserved for us in Cicero's speeches. And I think it is worth remembering at this point that although we think of Cicero's verines, there are also the non-forensic invective material that he delivered against Piso and Gabinius after his return from exile. But also we have a lovely fragment of Caelius's prosecution of Antonius in 59 that Quintilian has preserved, that shows not only that Caelius was a very attentive student of Cicero, but also gives us some reassurance that the kind of invective that we see Cicero using is not uniquely his. The predecessors for this late Republican invective are, in the absence of earlier speeches, more difficult to trace. Nonetheless, oratorical testimonial and fragments, when placed in the context of the development of provincial government during the 2nd century BC and associated legislation, provides some evidence, and that is what this paper is looking at. But the literary record of this phenomenon is not unidirectional. There was, I think, undoubtedly, invective derived from the conduct of provincial governors prior to Cicero. But the record of that invective is also shaped by Cicero, both by his prosecution of Verres and its massive written dissemination, and by his shaping of the history of Roman oratory in the treatises that he wrote in the latter part of his career. In this paper, I explore two specific instances where processes of recording and transmission in the 1st century BC have, I suggest, fundamentally shaped evidence about the 2nd century BC invective. These are senatorial interventions in the actions of magistrates outside. These are on the one hand, senatorial intervention in the actions of magistrates outside Rome in the 170s BC, which are often seen as the background to the creation of the first Quaestio de Repetundis in 149. And secondly, the trial of Galba in 149 itself, and his scandalous evasion of any penalty for the atrocities he was alleged to have committed in Hispania. In the first instance, I suggest that Livy's account of key episodes are shaped by repetundae cases at the end of the Republic, particularly that of Verres, which we can assume Livy was familiar with through Cicero's written version of that case. And Galba's case is preserved in some detail in Cicero, and Cicero's own handling of Galba changes over the course of his writings, reflecting quite clearly Cicero's changing concerns about the role and function of oratory, which lead him to emphasize different aspects of Galba as an oratory. Before analysing these two case studies, I begin with a brief survey of Cicero's oratorical engagement with provincial government in the Quaestio Repetundis and in the Senate, in order to look at the nature of the offence of repetundi and how it drove the invective which was used about those who were alleged to have committed it, not only in courts, but also in the wider context of the Senate. That oratorical context in turn shaped expectations, I suggest, about the origins of the offence when our 1st century BC writers came to think about the prehistory of the Repetundi court. In addition to the colossal prosecution of Verres, Cicero's activity as a defender in Repetundi cases survives in a number of his speeches. We have defences of Fonteius, of Flaccus, of Scaurus, and of Gaius Rabirius Postumus. Admittedly, the Fonteius and Scaurus speeches are quite damaged. A number of other Repetundi defences of his are also attested, either through surviving fragments or testimonia, which includes those for Oppius in 69 and perhaps a man called Fundenius. But there are also other defences where he seems not to have disseminated any written version of it. Those include those for Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the consul of 67, who was tried on Repetundi charges in 63. He defended Gaius Antonius in 59. That was the case I've already referred to, with a fragment of Caelius's prosecution is preserved, and also Aulus Gabinius in 54. He had familiarity with the court too. As praetor, this is the court that he had presided over, including the trial on this charge of Gaius Licinius Macer, which ended with the defendant's conviction and then his suicide, and also that of the ex-tribune Gaius Manilius. And he also contemplated defending Catiline on this charge in 65. So if we look at the range of Cicero's career and activity, perhaps only the charge of Wyss can rival Res Repetundi as the focus of his forensic expertise. And like Wyss, this was a charge on which Cicero brought a prosecution as well as a defence. In fact, these are the only two quaestiones in which Cicero appeared as a prosecutor. And in the case of Repetundi, the prosecution was, of course, that of Verres, a high-risk prosecution, we should not forget, given Verres' position and also Cicero's, that Cicero was much more advanced in his career than was normally than was the case in what we might call early career prosecutions, where a very young man prosecuted a more senior figure as a way of introducing himself into Roman public life. That was not the case with Cicero, who had been active in the courts by this point for a decade. So that willingness to prosecute makes Repetundi, I think, quite distinctive in Cicero's career. The Wyss prosecution is, of course, very much towards the end of it and in the context of Milo's conviction. Other things I think about the charge make it potentially distinctive. It had a compulsory second hearing. That, of course, explains the extraordinary bulk of the verines. It was the oldest of the quaestiones, and it had also a complicated history in statute. We have the Lex Calpurnia, which set the quaestio up in 149, but that was modified by at least 4 more laws on Repetundi before the Lex Cornelia de Rebus Repetundis of Sulla, as part of Sulla's overhaul of the quaestiones. And that piece of legislation was itself, of course, overtaken by Caesar's comprehensive law from 59, parts of which, as we know, remained in force well into the imperial period. We do not need to go into detail about the evolution of the offence as it can be reconstructed through these measures to highlight that this is a remarkable level of activity around the offence. And it is also evident that Repetundi became an arena of contest between different groups within the res publica. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, since the issue was not only the definition of the offence, a problematic question, but also the definition of those who should judge it, because it is in the context of Repetundi that we have the creation of non-senatorial juries. And it is tempting indeed to dismiss the origins of equestrian juries as an unintended, and the political context, consequences of that, as an unintended result of Gracchus's search for non-partisan jurors when he came to address this problem. But I think to simply say it was unintended misses a wider context here of provincial government and the role of magistrates within it. Equestrian jurors are one manifestation of competing economic and political interests outside Rome, which coalesce with new models of tax collection, which restrict the autonomy of magistrates and, by extension, the autonomy of the Senate. So to define who could extort was to engage directly with the way in which Rome extracted profit from its empire. So it is not surprising that this was an offence that was always politically contested and politically significant. And this is evident by developments in the offence meant that non-magistrates could potentially come under the scope of the legislation, as indeed happened in the case of Gaius Rabirius Postumus, is alleged to have received money which the Gabinian exacted illegally. And in the case of Rabirius, his own behaviour was not relevant, at least not in legal terms. The issue was whether any money that he possessed was in origin the result of Gabinius's extortion. It didn't matter, it seems, how he came to have it. But what is interesting, I think, about the pro-Rabirio speech, and this points ahead, I think, to some of the questions around invective more generally, the prosecutors in that case do seem to have combined an argument that Gabinius's extortions had reached Rabirius, which was the point of the case, the legal issue, with an attack on Rabirius's character. At least that is the implication of how Cicero turned to defend Rabirius. There were charges that Rabirius had adopted Greek dress, that he had behaved tyrannically when in Alexandria, that he had been engaged in personal enrichment. And therefore, these are matters that Cicero needs to address in that speech. And that's a pointer towards the overriding significance of personal behaviour in assessing repetundae cases. So that, I think, is by way of background before we turn to repetundae cases before the Quaestio de Repetundis. And if we can start with Livy now. We don't have Livy's narrative of what happened between 167 and 149, at least we only have it in the summaries. So we can't tell how and indeed whether he talked about the Lex Calpurnia in any detail at the time at which it was introduced. But there are two episodes from the surviving books which could prefigure the Lex Calpurnia. And these are the despoiling of a temple in 173 and complaints brought against Roman magistrates by inhabitants of Hispania in 171. These incidents can, I think, legitimately form part of the background to Lex Calpurnia, and indeed are often cited as part of the environment in which led Rome to decide that statute around this was required. But the way that Livy shapes his narrative of these two incidents also suggests the influence of late Republican oratory dealing with provincial government, particularly that of Cicero. So if we start with the despoiling of the temple of Juno Licinia in 173, this I think is the first passage on the handout. One of the censors is building a temple, which he has vowed earlier when he was praetor in Hispania, and he wants it to be magnificent, and therefore he removes some very fine marble roof tiles from a temple in southern Italy, the temple of Juno Licinia. And this is an organised activity. He has ships ready. He takes the tiles, or at least as many tiles as he thinks he's going to need, back to Rome. And the inhabitants of this community are unable to prevent him, or is frightened away from preventing him, because of his senatorial auctoritas. The tiles are taken to Rome. They are unloaded. They are taken to the building site, and word leaks out of their existence in Rome. there is an uproar. The matter is taken to the Senate. There is a senatorial debate, which Livy records in indirect statement, which stresses sacrilege. And in the end, the Senate decides to return the tiles and puts out a contract for that, and the tiles are returned. And the sad coda to the tale is when they are returned, no craftsman locally has the skill to replace them on the temple. And that's where the story is left. It is left unfinished, just like the temple. We are to imagine the tiles returned to the temple compound, but remaining on the ground, not on the roof. There's a coda to the story in the same book, in Livy, where he records the death of Flaccus, the censor in question, in the following year. And this is presented very much as a matter of divine vengeance, or that is the popular opinion about it, because Flaccus commits suicide after he hears that both his sons have died. And Livy records at that point a popular belief that he was mentally unsound and that he'd been driven mad by Juno. Now, this is evidently a very carefully shaped story. It has links to other elements in Livy's narrative, as Jaeger, in an important piece in Tapper in 2006, has explored. This is a temple, I mean, this is a famous temple, which recurs within Livy's narrative. But other elements in this, or another focus that we need to have when we look at this episode, do seem to be driven by the legislative framework around repetundae, which emerged some 20 or so years later. And the points, I think, which in the narrative as Livy tells it, which do that, are firstly that the process of exaction is made possible by gross disparities in power between Roman officials and local communities. It's interesting, I think, that Flaccus is not an imperium holding magistrate, in fact, and Livy is clearly alert to that when he describes his position as one of auctoritas. He is well aware of the difference, but as he tells it, the auctoritas allows him to carry out the deed over the unwillingness, the distress of those who are the victims of this appropriation. Another important point is about the flow of information, that it is only possible to put these kind of exactions right if word reaches Rome. The repetundae context leads us to want people to be in motion. Here, that's not the case. There isn't a formal complaint by the affected community, but somehow the rumour spreads. It is known, and therefore brought up in the Senate. And as a result, we have a senatorial debate and the solution about the return of the trials. But there are, I think, some unusual features to the scandal if we are approaching it as a proto-repetundae case. And that is the role of sacrilege. On Livy's telling, it's the offence to the gods which galvanised the Senate into action, with a very clear implication that theft from private individuals might not have caused such a panic. Even though such behaviour would be indignous. And the senatorial response also seems not to have dealt directly with Flaccus. And here I think this is a point of some significance to how we read the account of the senatorial debate. Livy imagines that he's the object of personal attack during the senatorial debate, that he's the object of invective. But in fact, the only recorded response is the decision to restore the tiles. So it shows us, this episode shows us the Senate willing to intervene to correct behaviour by officials distant from Rome. But I think it's less clear that it was prompted to do so by the ethical framework which Livy inserts into the debate around human misbehaviour, possibly driven by a vainglorious desire that the temple be finer than anybody else's, rather than a fear on the part of the Senate that sacrilege had been committed, which needed in some way to be expiated. So we could say that Livy takes a senatorial debate about the correct response to a potential instance of sacrilege and turns it into a story about a Roman official driven by personal ambition, if not direct personal gain, to seize property unlawfully. And as Jaeger notes in passing in that piece I referred to, this telling might remind the reader of Cicero's presentation of Verres. And I think the point could be amplified. Juno is, after all, a particular victim of Verres, who not only stripped her temple on Malta during his tenure in Sicily, but had also, when Dolabella's proquista, removed statues from her temple on Samos, which in fact were on display, according to Cicero, in Verres' house at the time of the trial. And this double sacrilege is recapitulated in Cicero's closing appeal to the gods at the very end of the fifth speech. He appeals to a range of gods, of whom Juno is, of course, only one. But when he appeals to Juno, he does it on the basis that she has been the victim of sacrilege and exactions at two of her temples. Okay. The other episode in Livy can be aligned even more clearly with the subsequent development of repetundae legislation. This is we are in the summer of 171. Envoys come to Rome from Hispania to complain to the Senate about the behaviour of Roman magistrates. The Senate responds by instructing one of the year's praetors, Lucius Canaleus, to set up a board of recuperatores to deal with each individual accused. And the recuperatores were to be senatorial, and the complainants were told to pick as patroni anyone they wished. So we have here what is looking very like a proto-quaestio. And the outcome of the hearings was one acquittal and 2 departures into exile. And when that set of hearings had been concluded, a senatorial decree was passed which limited future freedom of magistrates in relation to some aspect of the grain levy. It's not entirely clear what. So Livy presents this as a quasi-judicial process. And he uses forensic language. The accused are described as using the word reus. There are patroni, there are crimines charges, and there are acquittals, and departure into exile ahead of a verdict. Elements here foreshadow the later quaestio procedure. The complaint arises from non-Roman injured parties, but they are represented by Roman speakers. Each trial was adjourned at least once. And the recuperatores had the capacity to reach a public decision on what they had heard. What is less clear, I think, is what these recuperatores thought they were looking for, or indeed what they could have done if they found it. After all, Titinius was acquitted, and the hearings involving 2 of the other magistrates, Furius Philus and Marcus Matianus, collapsed when those individuals failed to turn up after adjournment. Neither was actually found guilty. The subsequent senatorial decree can be taken as a demonstration that the issue was one which required the explicit statement of regulation governing the behaviour of magistrates, but it doesn't, I think, imply that those regulations were clearly understood or articulated in the hearings themselves. Another point I think worth noting about this occasion is, in addition to the quasi-judicial framing of it, is the way that Livy presents it as tainted by senatorial corruption. Not only in its origins, that this is the misbehaviour of magistrates, but also in the belief which he claims was current at the time, that potential hearings which involved more senior individuals than the 3 ex-praetors who were actually dealt with, had been quashed by unnamed members of the Senate. And in this respect too, parallels could be drawn with Verres' trial, or at least Cicero's narrative of it, with a plot against justice which Verres has hatched with his powerful supporters, and which is being foiled only through Cicero's exceptional courage, diligence, and skill in ensuring that the trial is not deferred to the following year. Before we leave this episode, however, it cannot, I suggest, simply be seen as the imposition by Livy of an entirely anachronistic repetundae frame. We are somewhere in a murky middle ground, I think, between a repetundae frame imposed and what we might say were already proto-repetundae aspects. And the reason I think we need to be very careful is that we do have some evidence for oratory that was delivered at these hearings. The grammarian Carisius offers us a quotation from what he describes as Cato's speech Pro Hispanis de Frumento. Not a terribly helpful quotation in itself. Its purpose is to illustrate the use of the adverb utrinde, but nonetheless Carisius thinks he's quoting Cato's words. Cato is recorded as one of the 4 advocates that were chosen as patroni, and I think there's a good case for saying that this particular quotation comes from this particular occasion, insofar as I think it is the only known occasion where Cato spoke in Rome on behalf of people who could be described as Hispani. That doesn't imply that it circulated under this title, but I think it does suggest that Cato preserved in writing this speech. Also, a mention in Stu Dasconius's commentary on Cicero's Divinatio in Caecilium seems to confirm that the handling of the grain supply featured in what one of the other patroni, Lucius Furius Philus, said on behalf of the Hispani. So if that's the case, that we seem to have a fragment of part of a speech that Cicero delivered on this occasion and a testimonium about a speech by somebody else on this occasion, that gives us some indication of the political importance of the case, as well as offering a very early example of a quasi-repetundae speech, which the individuals who gave that speech thought was worth preserving in some form in writing. Okay, so let me turn now to Galba and Servius Sulpicius Galba's trial or quasi-trial in 149. The background to this, I'm sure, is familiar, but just to recap, this man was praetor in 151 in Hispania Ulterior. He'd been prorogued into the following year, and during this 2-year command, it was alleged that he had tricked into surrender a large number of Lusitanians, but then had them killed or sold into slavery. And when he returned to Rome, proceedings against him were initiated by one of the tribunes of the year, Lucius Scribonius Libo. But it seems that this was one of those occasions when tribunician activity had broad senatorial support, including indeed that of Cato. Now, we don't know whether the speeches that were delivered around this, what seems to be a judicial process, was in fact a judicial process, or in fact speeches delivered in the context of the legislation which would have enabled a trial. It probably doesn't matter very much for our purposes today. We know Galba spoke in his own defense, and Cato spoke against him. He included his speech in the Origenes. And the case became notorious, particularly notorious, because Galba was not acquitted. Galba was not convicted, or a case against him didn't proceed. He escaped any penalty for his actions, even though everybody thought he was guilty. And he escaped not because of any merit in his case, it seems, but by the way he evoked pity among his hearers by deploying children. He presented 2 of his sons and the son of a relative to those who were going to make the decision on him, and dwelt on what would happen to them if they were deprived of him as a result of the proceedings which he faced. So, as I said, Galba was acquitted or not convicted. But this was, of course, the year in which the Quaestio Dei Repetundis was established. And it seems likely that there's some causal link between these two. Even though, interestingly, when you actually come to look at the number of Repetundae cases that we know about in the years immediately following, there aren't actually very many. In the period of 18 years between 149 and Tiberius, 16 years between this year and Tiberius Gracchus' tribunate, we only know of 3 cases, for example. So it doesn't seem to have been hugely busy immediately, but nonetheless, some sense that there could be a link between what is presented, at least in our sources, as something of a scandal and the legislative response to it. And it is striking, I think, when we read the accounts of it, that he was acquitted for reasons that had seemed to have very little to do with the facts of the case themselves. And indeed, the only other indication about the arguments that Galba deployed himself, other than the presentation of these children, also points in that direction, because he apparently claimed that he had received information about a surprise attack that was planned by the Lusitanians, and this explained his attack on them. And shifting the ground from a commander's behaviour to threats against the res publica is a technique for which examples can easily be found in Cicero's speeches, for example. And Cicero does seem to have been very interested by this case and returns to it in both, well, he treats it at length in De Oratore and returns to it in Brutus. And in De Oratore, Antonius, the character Antonius, uses it as a lengthy exemplum in his opening response to Crassus in the first book, in order to demonstrate the practical oratorical power of emotion, regardless of any theoretical framework which might underpin it. So it is a challenge, really. It serves as an example to try to challenge Crassus's emphasis on the need for education and method. In Brutus, it serves to demonstrate that Galba was one of the two leading orators of his generation. And the fact that his chief opponent in this pivotal case was Cato, a leading orator of the previous generation who is defeated on this occasion, also supports the model of oratory that's so strong a feature in the Brutus as one of teleological progression through the generations. What is noticeable is, I think, if we look at these two accounts, is both the extent to which Cicero presents Galba as a positive oratorical model, which is an interesting aspect of it, but also the shift between the two versions, De Oratore and Brutus, from a focus on emotion as a means of defeating an apparently foregone conclusion, to a much more schematic approach in the second, in Brutus, which serves Cicero's history of oratory as one shaped by competition between and within generations, but beneficial competition. Okay, let me try to draw some points together before I finish. So this brief survey of some moments in the oratorical prehistory of the Repetundae court highlights a fundamental difficulty inherent in any attempt to write a history of oratory at Rome, or explore the relationship between Cicero, our first surviving orator, in complete speeches, and his predecessors. The evidence for early oratory is refracted through later writers on whom we rely for the evidence, Cicero above all. The material that Cicero preserves about early oratory and orators is always driven by the argument of his own text, whether it is as straightforward as exemplifying an argument within a forensic speech, or as complicated as creating a series of histories of Roman oratory, which serve his own understanding of oratory, his own oratory, and the res publica at different times of their composition. Cicero made of Galba's troubles in 149 first a dramatic piece of theatre, which showed that successful oratory at Rome had to be firmly grounded within Roman social and cultural practices in ways that could not be satisfactorily taught or replicated by imported theory. And secondly, a standoff between two great orators, which nonetheless showed that the younger generation of orators would naturally supersede the older, in a res publica, that is, which was functioning correctly, unlike the situation in which he wrote Brutus in 46. Livy, too, does not approach the behaviour of magistrates outside Rome without an interpretative framework. At the very least, he sees in the handling of the problem rich narrative opportunities to underscore the possibility of collective as well as individual moral failure on the part of Rome's elite, both in respect of other human entities and of the divine. This is a narrative shaped by Livy, by the history of his own times and that immediately prior, and one which we should also, I think was shaped by the texts which he had read about the late Republic, and particularly Cicero's attempts to deal with the problem of the Repetundae cases. Add to this framework of reception is the minuscule scale of the oratorical fragments available to us. So, for example, we can on occasion suspect intertextuality, but it is very, very difficult to demonstrate in all but a handful of cases. And the value of looking at Cicero's predecessors lies not, I think, really in opportunities to identify links at the level of language or specific ideas, but much more in terms of how oratory functioned as a skill which individuals could use and as a mechanism within collective decision-making. So, and this is the concluding point, if we want to explore pre-Ciceronian oratory, for which there is a great deal of evidence of some sort or another, we must carefully reflect on the reception history of the material we have. It is shaped by a complex history of the very end of the Republic, in particular. And I hope that this brief survey of a couple of particular episodes have shown you some of the problems of trying to reconstruct oratory around extortion prior to Cicero. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I see that some of us are using the clap emoji or icon or whatever it's called. But yes, thank you very much indeed. Right, plenty of time and indeed scope for questions. Well, in which case I'll start with a general and indeed generic question on this working concept that you've been using of proto-repetundae case. Could you expand a bit more on what's behind that proto?
Well, at its simplest, I guess it's simply the point that we don't have a standing quaestio until 149. Okay, but we clearly have activity or debate in Rome prior to that around the behaviour of magistrates overseas. And a sense, at least that is what emerges from the Livian material that I've been discussing from the Galba case, that certain forms of behaviour, even if they are not directly detrimental to Roman interests, are nonetheless not to be countenanced. I mean, I suppose a question that I haven't addressed here, but I kind of is interesting, is, and I mean, it's not necessarily to be combined to the early part of the 2nd century BC, is how we align what we think of as repetundae cases, which involve theft from non-Romans, which is facilitated by Roman power, from magisterial incompetence, military defeat or so on, which is also obviously a matter of at times intense debate and decision. But I think what the distinction would be is that it's this emergence of a sense that there are forms of behaviour that are unacceptable, even though you can't point to any detriment to Rome's interests. And again, that needs to be modified at points. But I mean, if we turn to the Fulvius Flaccus case, okay, and try to get past Livy's sense that this is a tragic spectacle. One way of talking about what's going on then would be to say it's a conflict between two versions of how you serve the Republic's interests. Because on the one hand, here is an opportunity to appropriate for Rome and enhance its relationship with its divine protectors by taking spoils of empire. Right. Okay. So it's not necessarily clear to me that we need to come up with a framework in which Flaccus is doing a bad thing. Okay. I mean, Livy clearly wants us to think he's deluded and sacrilegious from the outset. But there is, of course, a view of that activity that says, he is serving the interests of the res publica. And the problem arises when other people say, for whatever reason, and of course, who can really say securely they understand what might have been going on in Rome in the 170s, let alone the validity or otherwise of factional politics. But you've got another group, for whatever reason, saying, look, hang on, this is actually sacrilege. It's a temple of Juno, wherever it happens to be. We cannot just pinch the material and repurpose it in order to add glory to our relationship with Fortuna Equestris, right? And therefore, we need to do something about this, guys. We are heading for disaster, right? So, I think we don't need to buy into the Flaccus model of insanity, or the Livian model of Flaccan insanity. Okay, so how does that relate back to what you were saying? Well, I suppose the reason I think we've got a proto-repetundae is two reasons. I mean, firstly, there is clearly, if we can put any trust in any of our evidence, debate at Rome about topics which later on would be the kind of activity that might fall under the Quaestio de Repetundis. And secondly, we seem to have a historiographical tradition that wants to extend the scope of the Quaestio de Repetundis back a little bit.
Yes, and I do wonder to what extent it may be helpful to link up the Flaccus episode with the instances of mistreatment of Italian allies that you get scattered in the 2nd century BC, and that of course Gaius Gracchus denounces.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's a missing bit of the puzzle. And of course, we do have some very nice fragments about this, which also show us that, and which are also treated within a moral framework that, even if it doesn't lead to repetundae, looks quite similar to repetundae cases in terms of how you identify what is wrong about this. And even though such abuses don't necessarily lead to material deprivation. So I think you're absolutely right. I would very much agree with that. Gaius Gracchus is the missing link in many respects around this.
Yes,
we have a question in the chat room. Yeah, as you see, we have a question in the chat room.
Yeah. So we got a question from Oded and then one from Luca.
Okay.
Oded, off you go. Oded? In which case, Luca can go first, and then Oded can chip in next. Luca Grillo, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Catherine, for this very stimulating paper, which I do agree with you does challenge some of the assumptions that are easily made, always through the filter of the evidence we have from Cicero. I would like to add one sort of episode to your discussion. And I don't quite know what it's going to do to it, but I think it probably would go in the same direction that you took, Catherine. An episode from 179 narrated by Livy in book 37 came to mind, which is the furious discussion caused by Nobilior stealing the statues from the Temple of Ambracia. Livy says that his big opponent, Fulvius Flaccus, used it clearly as a means of invective because they were already enemies. They already crossed swords before in the Senate. And at the peak of the description of the misconduct of these Roman magistrates in Greece and Ambracia, there is the fact that he took down, he stripped the temples of the statues. If I am correct, and I have not checked this, if I am correct, that does not spill into a court case. It remains circumscribed to a discussion in the debate. And what's interesting, and I wonder if that can help your case, Catherine, what's interesting is that Nobilius' response is that he consecrates the statues to a temple. So there's sort of this concern with the possible religious dimension of the attack, but there's actually no restitution to the provincials and so on. And I wonder if that's why it's on the proto, to follow Federico's language and your language, discourse about the repetundis without actually translated into repetundis. Thank you. I just wonder what...
Yeah, that's a really helpful point. I'm sure, I mean, I do need to look at that, and I'm sure you're right that this it supports this this sense both that we do have proto-repetundae, but that the way that it's presented is potentially shaped by repetundae legislation as it comes to be. And again, statue stealing, it's so difficult. It seems difficult for Livy to be writing about statue stealing without that being inflected in some way through Verres. To shape the nature of the offence. But that's a really helpful point. Thank you. I will follow that up as another.
I don't remember where. I can send you the reference, but yeah, it's yeah. I think it's an interesting episode.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's really helpful.
It's all connected because, of course, Nobilior took to Greece Ennius, and he kind of stole it from the other Patronus Cato. Therefore, the previous guess by Malcovati that that is what triggered the uti praeda in commune referatur or something like that. But there's no evidence for that. I mean, I am not teaching you about that, but there's no evidence for that. So there's like also this tense historical context. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah.
It looks like Oded is having issues with his microphone. So he's typed his question, and then after this question, Dominic Maszek has got one. But first, Oded's typed question. Regarding the representation of provinces, are there places that appear more in speeches than others?
Well, I haven't done a systematic survey. It's a really good question. I think Hispania is a constant recurrent source of debate, more perhaps than other places. Or at least when we're thinking about provincial misgovernment, I think. But I think that cannot be separated from the nature of Rome's military history in Hispania over this period, which is just not a satisfactory story of triumph and followed by triumph, followed by triumph. I mean, it's a problematic, muddled, frustrating situation, and again, it's how that is reflected in the yes, as you say, could it be because the pacification took so long? Absolutely. So there's much more. I mean, there's much more scope for things to go wrong. Right. First of all, we have far more unsuccessful, incompetent, unlucky Roman generals in Hispania than we do elsewhere. All of which leads itself to reflection on what they're up to. Because I mean, again, another episode we might, another sort of set of events you might bring into consideration here is precisely Hostilius Mancinus and his defeat. And what again was clearly quite intense debate around what should be done about that episode, which also, of course, has a religious dimension. So I think that would probably be the line to pursue. But I don't have any figures to back that up in terms of speeches.
Dominic.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for the great paper. Perhaps taking up from Luca Grillo's point, just another instance of this kind of proto-repetundae, if you like, would be the questions of the spoils from Capua in 210 BCE, where the pontifices were actually put in charge of making sure that the statues were classified as either cult statues or kind of private statues, which then were not. This would not have been a matter of sacrilege, of course. So I think that the whole idea of sacrilege in the case of Fulvius Flaccus should perhaps not be fully discounted, because there were some precedents here where we can see that on an institutional level, they took it very seriously, also in terms of dealing with the spoils from defeated cities, also in Italy. So I think that might also serve as an indication or as a bridge perhaps to Cicero's speech against Verres, where he talks about Gaius Hius in Sicily, right? The shrine, the statue, which is of course a sacrilege. So perhaps this can serve as an institutional bridge, if you like. But I really found the paper fascinating.
Thank you. No, that's a really good point. Another really interesting episode that could be brought in. And clearly, I mean, when we get on to repetundae, as you know, in the end of the Republic, sacrilege helps. Okay, it's a useful argumentative device in order to underscore the nature of the problem. And to make the case that a particular individual has overstepped the bounds of what is acceptable. Because I mean, I think repetundae does seem to be an offence where interpretation rather than questions of fact is inescapable. So yeah, but that's a very helpful point. Thank you.
Other questions? Henrietta.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think I had the benefit of hearing this in a different version, but I noticed that you've shifted it in interesting ways. And the one thing that I was interested, well, I was interested in many things, but there was one thing where I thought, so this question, this moral question, when is it too wrong and people have to act, and what is wrong about it? It made me think of a project that is running at the moment. It's a German UK project led on the UK side by Marta Mosillo, which is on corruption. And it's both about, you know, corruption as it stands, but also this gray zone between what is legal or illegal, but in between that, where do people think, oh, that is too much? And so it's not that I have a particular question, but I just wonder whether a chat with Marta might benefit your thinking about this gray zone. Where does it tip over, even if it's not illegal? Where does it tip over in people's ideas, and how can that be exploited rhetorically?
I think that's a really interesting point, because again, I mean, somebody needs to decide to bring a prosecution, always, and one of the questions that I think is your question provokes is to what it, I mean, how far does again, let's take the post 149 situation when we have a quaestia. How far is the decision to bring a prosecution shaped by popular opinion? I mean, we need Christina here, and she's here. That is, how far does an advocate respond to this and think, aha, there is public support for this. But I think the way that Livy shapes the Fulvius Flaccus episode, I mean, it does seem to be very peculiar in a way, his unwillingness to say how the Senate hears about it. You know, it can't be concealed, even though everyone is silent, but it can't be concealed. There seems to be something about information flow that is going there. I don't know whether Christina is still around. Maybe she's had to leave.
I think she might be, but she's muted. Yes, she is. Come on, you're officially on the spot, Christina.
Yeah, we need you.
We need you.
Sorry, technical question moments. Can I just enter in like 3 minutes, please?
Of course. Of course. We got a very warm round of thanks from Claudia. I do have a quick question, which does not impinge on the overall. Okay, you're back. Excellent. Hi, Christina. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Yes. Well, I heard this because I had to leave for a second, so I heard this of Henrietta's question. Yes, Marta's project is very fascinating regarding those twisted transfers, or those moments of not very clear, ambiguity, and how it can be perceived. Sociologists call it the gray zone of corruption, because sometimes people think that it's corruption, but the law doesn't. Or the opposite, people think that, this is not clearly corruption, but, the law punishes. So it's how that developed. And regarding that question and your very exciting paper, Catherine, I was wondering about a case in 170 where Aulus Hortensius is in Abdera, and he demands a huge amount of grain. And the city says, okay, but we will send ambassadors to Rome to check with the Senate if that is okay. So he decided to destroy completely the city. So the Abderites, well, the inhabitants of Abdera go to the Senate, they complain, but the Senate just chastises a bit Hortensius. So it's the kind of cases that you are looking around, how that forms the proto-corruption, the proto-quaestio of Repetunda that you may also look at that. I can send you the reference if you are interested.
No, that sounds also very, very helpful. Thank you. And in a sense, I mean, that opens up a slightly different set of questions about the nature of corruption, because it's, you know, the military context and the need for supplies. I mean, it's a different way of shaping the, as you say, this grey zone between, on the one hand, this is military necessity, and on the other hand, overstepping some difficult to articulate boundaries. Yeah, so that will be one to look at. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've got a question as well, if I may. Do you think that I really love how you put into perspective the importance of the preservation of those pre-Ciceronian speeches, how that effort to have them circulated or preserved or whatever we call them. So do you think that there were some issues or political matters that pre-Ciceronian time made that those speeches were published or circulated? We have seen that with Repetunda, you know, they were more likely, or they were subject that an orator would say, okay, I'm going to preserve that speech for posterity. Do you think that there are other kind of speeches? And if so, can we see a difference or not between the choices that Cicero did? What do you think?
That's a really, really interesting question, and I don't have a good answer, I think, as yet. The problem, I think, though it's also, of course, an opportunity, is the dominance within pre-Ciceronian oratory that was disseminated in writing of Cato. Right. And Cato's surviving speeches, I mean, they span genres. He records important senatorial interventions, but he does also seem to have been very keen to record his very active forensic career. And so, although I think he is a very rich source for trying to establish parameters for publishing, not least because he seems to have, you know, been the initiator of this particular textual phenomenon. I think we need to be careful in letting him be normative for what people following him did. Because what does seem to be the case, and again, you know, the evidence is not great, but what does seem to be the case is we have Cato being massively textual. And then we have about, you know, what, 70 years in which people do turn to texts, but they turn to texts much more selectively. Okay. Nobody between Cato and Cicero seems to have quite this overwhelming desire to record their entire career, or at least to make it possible to do biography from speeches. So we have much more selectivity, and I suspect if one settles down to do that analysis, which I haven't done, but it's, you know, something that needs to be done, we'll find a pattern of dissemination that is less driven by any clear patterns that particular topics or cases or environments are particularly sexy, and much more about high points in an individual's career. Because I think the other thing is that Cicero and Cato, between them, give us a very misleading impression of how busy most orators are, even those who are quite active forensically. And that again is a factor, because many people, even the kind of characters who amble through the Brutus defining generations, you know, okay, we don't have all the evidence, etc., but were they really that busy, or are we talking much more about a much smaller number of cases which they were involved in, and that too having an impact on their decisions around textual preservation. So I think, you know, Cato is inescapable, and he's so valuable because we have fragments, and therefore we have a sense, even if the fragments are so kind of frustrating, that this isn't just somebody else's narrative. Okay, yes, why is anything preserved, etc., but at least, and then he's clearly bizarre in so many respects, and not a model for how members of the Roman elite without his set of status issues used text in order to do whatever it is they thought text was doing for them. But thank you, really, really good question.
Thanks.
Luca has one more question. Luca Grillo.
Thank you. I'm happy to let other people go if there's anybody on. No. Okay, just very briefly, again, thank you, Catherine. I wonder if it could be helpful, and it's perhaps already present in Nuke in your paper, to have a sort of distinction between what we would call, following Federico's language, the proto-repetundis, and try to break through this filter and see what happened before, but also to look at the, so to speak, the de repetundis manque. So the attempts of make a case de repetundis, which actually did not quite happen. And I bring this up because it was, at least in Cicero, as you certainly know, a big topos of invective was you treated provincials as defeated enemies. And this also, of course, had some specific legal connotation. You cannot take down the statues of gods, to go back to the example, unless there is the vocatio. And the vocatio implies a declared war and just victory and so forth. So I just wonder if that is a helpful category to think with. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it is a helpful category. And of course, you know, when we think about Cicero as an orator in repetundae cases, then we look at his repetundae cases. But to ignore the material about Piso and Gabinius is in many ways slightly peculiar within that. I mean, yes, I like that idea of repetundae manque, and I think the idea that he thought about and bottled out of a prosecution of Piso, and of course got involved in the prosecution of Gabinius on the wrong side from the point of view of his moral approach to Gabinius's behaviour. Absolutely, I think you are on something. And again, how far is that a phenomenon that we can see happening earlier? I mean, one thing that does spring to mind there is if we think about Gaius Gracchus, and if we think about, I mean, to go back to Federico's point about the mistreatment of the Italians, that seems to be in a contional context. And what is very striking about the big fragment there about the baths is he doesn't name the magistrate involved. So that again looks like some sort of hesitation. I mean, Gracchus could have brought a prosecution de repetundis, but I mean that doesn't really seem to work, does it? But there is something around how you tackle these problems and what you do with them in a political context. And of course, in the Gracchus context, it's he eschews the opportunity. He either eschews the opportunity to create hostility against a particular individual in favour of making a more general case, or everybody knows who that was, and he doesn't need to name the name, which I think we have actually to assume for that particular case. But nice point. Not quite sure where one could take it, but it's worth thinking about. Yeah.
I suppose one possible place where you could take it is the emergence of the majestas offense as a way of thinking through how to exploit your subjects, and I mean, Dominic's earlier point on the coterminous nature of sacrilegium and repetundae is also part of this, in many ways, very second century BC issue, which is about coming up with new legal categories to make sense of the existence of the empire. Yeah. But anyway, I'm imposing. We have a question from Tuli Alholm.
Oh, yeah, that's me. Thanks for a wonderful paper, Catherine. So this is to some degree a question from ignorance, so I don't know how helpful or not it will be. But I'm interested, how much could we think about this evolution from proto-repetundae and to repetundae and so forth, also in relation to what happens with sort of Roman magistrates' documentary practices and accountability, and sort of, because we go somewhere from the 2nd century, is it around 187 when we have these episodes where Scipios tear up accounts in the Senate and these sort of things, to somewhere getting to the point where, at least in late Republic, in the Verrine times, there is a sort of, seems to be some sort of official legal obligation, though I'm not quite sure, is it actually legal or is it more sort of, suppose, mos maiorum convention type of thing, that when magistrate and officers return to Rome, they have to render accounts for the Senate to see. But where does this evolution happen? Is there somewhere, maybe in Lex Repetundae, official clause that from now on magistrates have to do it? Or I don't know, is this something that could be helpful, this relationship with bureaucracy? And
yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's one on which my ignorance is profound. But I suppose the interesting question would be, do we have a, I mean, if we've got a development in practices and expectations around record keeping, how far is it driven by the possibility of a repetundae prosecution? And I think the place I would immediately start looking for that is what Cicero says about record keeping in his letters from Cilicia.
right.
Just because he's so worried about prosecution. Though having said that, I do think we have a terrible tendency to underestimate the complexity of well, provincial government in its wider sense, including the activities of public contractors. You know, this is not a world in which you can operate effectively without very, very good record keeping. And you know, Scipio in 187 tearing up books, well, yeah, okay, but you know, that's a coup de théâtre. I don't think we need to assume that he didn't have very good records. He was just saying, I'm not going to talk to you, scum, about what's in them. But it's a really interesting question, yeah, and definitely a factor in this story of evolution.
Very much. Other questions? Comments? Speaking of record keeping, a very quick question from me. Do you think Livy is resorting to some sort of official document as one of his sources in the Flaccus passage that we talked about?
No. I mean, Jaeger makes the argument that what we've got going on in this episode is precisely the kind of translation from analytic record keeping to historiography.
Yes.
Right? That we take kind of the bare facts of a senatorial debate and a senatorial decision, and we turn it into, you know, a complex, emotionally engaging narrative that exemplifies, you know, key aspects around Roman behavior. And I mean, I think that seems to me to be a very nice way of looking at that episode, and indeed, you know, so much of what we find. But what that implies about exactly what Livy was using, I'm less clear. I mean, official records or an analytic account, which is, you know, not entirely clear to me. And I mean, in a sense, that's simply shoving the problem back. Somebody at some point must have had some records to look at about senatorial decrees, but quite how much mediation they've been done. I mean, I don't think we necessarily need to. I don't think this episode necessarily means that we need to abandon the comfortable view that Livy is not engaged in primary research.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Christina. We followed it up. Yes. Oh, yeah, that's it. Yes, indeed. Other questions, comments, or indeed last-minute bibliographical tips? In which case, I think we should thank Catherine very warmly indeed for this brilliant and in so many ways compelling paper. Thank you very much indeed. And well, I think we've been off to an excellent start, thanks to Catherine, and indeed to the optic fiber behaving properly and not letting us down. We'll be back, very many thanks to you all. Yes, we'll be back next week, same time, same place, different Zoom link, with a paper by our colleague Clément Bure from the University of Albi. A Zoom link will be sent in due course, and we very much hope to see many of you there and then. Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry, if I could just say something. Thank you very much to the organizers, Federica and Mattia, for this great opportunity. After so many months without proper conferences, it's so nice to see so many of the colleagues, so many familiar faces.
Indeed.
Meet new people. So it's really, really a treat. Thank you, Federica and Mattia, for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course.
See you soon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.